The Mike Johnson and Jamie Raskin confrontation was never going to look like a simple partisan food fight. It is the kind of conflict that grows inside institutions before it fully reveals itself in public. One man is the Speaker of the House, the curator of what can move and what can be smothered. The other is one of the sharpest constitutional prosecutors in the Democratic caucus, a lawmaker who believes that pretending extraordinary presidential conduct is ordinary can itself become a form of institutional failure. Put those two men into the same national moment, especially one involving Trump, Iran, and revived discussion of presidential removal, and you do not get a normal disagreement. But you get a struggle over whether the House of Representatives is still an institution of constitutional restraint or increasingly a protective chamber for presidential force when the president and the speaker belong to the same political camp. That is the real story. Not simply Raskin reviving 25th Amendment machinery, not simply Johnson blocking it, but a much larger battle over whether constitutional alarm is allowed to count as serious inside the House before it is politically too late. That is why this pair matters. Jamie Raskin's politics in moments like these are built around one instinct. When a president appears volatile enough to threaten constitutional order, Congress cannot hide behind institutional timidity and hope the problem stabilizes itself. And Mike Johnson's politics in moments like these are built around a different instinct. When Democrats escalate rhetoric about removal, incapacity, or emergency accountability, a Republican House should deny that escalation procedural oxygen. Those instincts collided again when Trump's Iran rhetoric and war posture pushed some Democrats back toward the language of removal. Raskin's effort to revive a commission framework around the 25th Amendment was never likely to become law in a House controlled by Republicans. But that does not make it unimportant. In fact, its practical weakness is part of what makes it politically revealing. Because the real fight is not only over enactment, it is over atmosphere. Raskin is trying to constitutionalize alarm. Johnson is trying to proceduralize resistance to that alarm. That is the confrontation. So Raskin's move matters because the 25th Amendment has always occupied a strange place in the public imagination. It is real constitutional machinery, but it feels almost taboo. Once a lawmaker begins talking about it seriously, the country senses that the ordinary vocabulary of disagreement is no longer enough for at least part of the opposition. That is why the renewed push carries such charge. Raskin is not merely saying Trump made another troubling statement. He is saying the category of concern may have shifted. This is not only about policy, rhetoric, or style. It may be about capacity, judgment, and whether the constitutional system still has the courage to prepare for the possibility of presidential instability. Johnson cannot treat that as neutral. If he treats it as neutral, he grants that the House might legitimately need to engage a president of his own party through a framework associated with severe incapacity or emergency correction. His entire role pushes in the opposite direction. He must keep Trump's legitimacy institutionally intact for as long as possible, especially when the challenge comes in high-voltage constitutional language like impeachment, incapacity, or removal. That is why the conflict is so rich. Raskin wants the House to behave as though an emergency framework may be needed. Johnson wants the House to behave as though raising such a framework is itself a partisan escalation that should be quarantined, not normalized. Those are entirely different ideas of stewardship. Raskin's idea says the Constitution gives Congress language for moments when executive conduct becomes dangerous enough that ordinary routines no longer feel adequate. If lawmakers refuse to use that language because it sounds too dramatic, then constitutional order becomes weaker exactly when it needs courage. Johnson's idea says Democrats are too eager to dramatize Trump and would happily turn every extraordinary statement into grounds for emergency-level intervention if given procedural space. In that view, the Speaker's refusal to elevate such efforts is not cowardice. It is institutional discipline against theatrical escalation. That is why the Johnson-Raskin confrontation is structural, even when it does not produce one perfect shouting match clip. It lives in what is allowed to move. It lives in what is denied a hearing. It lives in what counts as serious and what gets dismissed as fringe. That is the Speaker's hidden advantage. Mike Johnson does not have to defeat Jamie Raskin's constitutional logic point by point every time Raskin raises alarm about Trump. He simply has to control process, floor time, committee oxygen, and majority attention well enough that Raskin's argument never acquires the institutional legitimacy it would need to become dangerous. In that sense, Johnson is not merely debating Raskin, he is curating the boundaries of congressional seriousness. Raskin understands that perfectly, which is why his politics are often designed to force constitutional questions into public visibility before the institution is ready to carry them. He knows that once the Speaker decides something is unserious, the easiest path for other lawmakers is to treat it the same way. So his first task is not procedural victory. It is moral reframing. He must persuade the public that what sounds extraordinary may in fact be exactly what constitutional seriousness requires under extraordinary conduct. That is what makes the revived commission idea so interesting. It is not only legislation, it is a message to allies, donors, activists, and wavering lawmakers that the level of concern has become formal, constitutional, and potentially disqualifying. Raskin knows the odds are poor, but he also knows that the shadow cast by a measure can matter even when the measure itself does not move. Johnson knows that too, and he understands that allowing even limited institutional daylight to a 25th Amendment framework would lengthen the shadow over Trump's legitimacy. So he uses the powers of speakership not simply to manage votes, but to manage shadow length. That is one of the best ways to understand this pair. They are rival shadow managers. Raskin wants the shadow of presidential danger to lengthen. Johnson wants the shadow of House protection around Trump to remain broad enough that Democratic alarms still look smaller by comparison. There is also a history problem here, and it matters. Raskin is one of the Democrats most associated with the idea that constitutional norms are more fragile than many politicians admit, and therefore require unusually explicit defense when Trump is involved. Johnson, by contrast, who has long been associated with greater tolerance for Trump's claims, grievances, and legal or constitutional brinkmanship. That means neither side sees the other as a neutral custodian. Raskin does not see Johnson as a dispassionate manager of procedure. He sees him as a gatekeeper whose record already suggests deep tolerance for Trump-centered constitutional stretching. Johnson does not see Raskin as a neutral constitutional scholar. He sees him as one of the Democrats most inclined to elevate Trump into the category of emergency every time the political temperature rises. That mutual suspicion is why the argument cannot be settled through one clean debate. When Raskin says the House may need to think in 25th Amendment terms, Johnson's side hears opportunistic escalation. When Johnson blocks that frame from becoming meaningful inside the House, Raskin's side hears institutional cowardice disguised as prudence. Neither thinks the other is simply mistaken. Each thinks the other's constitutional posture is corrupted by prior allegiance. That is why the April moment matters so much. It did not emerge in a vacuum. It emerged after Trump's threatening language about Iran, after military escalation, after renewed public anxiety over his judgment, and after Democrats once again found themselves asking whether ordinary opposition vocabulary was enough. In practical terms, a 25th Amendment route remains extraordinarily difficult. But politically, that is almost beside the point. The moment you revive the language, you are telling the country the level of concern has changed. That is exactly what Raskin wants, and exactly what Johnson wants to prevent. This is why the pair works so well for long-form narrative. One man is trying to force the House into a constitutional register most politicians prefer never to touch. The other is trying to keep the House from entering that register at all. That is not just left versus right. It is a fight over how institutions decide what kind of alarm is real. And it touches something deep in public psychology. Americans are uncomfortable with the idea that presidential fitness could become an active congressional question. It sounds destabilizing, humiliating, and abnormal. That discomfort makes it politically hazardous to raise and politically hazardous to ignore. Raskin is willing to bear the first hazard. Johnson is willing to bear the second. That is a very pure constitutional confrontation, and it is also why the story belongs in long form rather than a short recap. The deeper issue is not whether the commission proposal will pass. It will not. The deeper issue is whether the House still knows how to distinguish between extraordinary alarm and ordinary opposition when the president himself is the subject. Raskin wants to test that distinction. Johnson wants to prevent the test from becoming institutional reality. That is the whole fight. Raskin thinks refusal is how democracies sleepwalk. Johnson thinks dramatization is how democracies get destabilized by partisan theater. Raskin believes the danger is underreaction. Johnson believes the danger is overactivation. Raskin wants the House to be a constitutional break. Johnson wants the House to deny Democrats the legitimacy of turning alarm into structure. But the country hears both. And because Trump remains at the center of the dispute, neither side can back down without betraying its whole theory of the age. That is why the confrontation still matters. Not because it gives you one perfect cable news moment. Because it reveals one of the deepest hidden conflicts in the modern House. Whether constitutional emergency is something to be named and prepared for, or something to be denied institutional standing until naming it becomes politically useless. That is the real Johnson-Raskin story. And that is why it still feels unfinished.